Debra D. We're listening to Claude Doves. This is a music video that I filmed in Siesta Key, and I filmed with Camila Cantanio there on this music video. And then on my other music video, Comments, I filmed with Brandon Gomes. I just love them both. They're on that great show on MTV, Siesta Key. The new season's on now. Lots of interesting stuff, so tune in. So today, I'm playing Claude Doves because it's talking about family. It's talking about trying to find and help people. And I was recently able to finally sit down and read through this journal that was put together in the 1980s by my great aunt Amelia. Helena was her sister. And she used to be a school teacher, so she was pretty good at keeping facts and information. And that's where I found out about 3 relatives I never knew I had. And it was picking up this book and reading this, although I have not made it all the way through because it gets pretty graphic and it's really hard to understand until you read how devastating disease was back just even a century ago, and how lucky we are today to have modern medicine and everything at hand, hospitals, clinics, doctors with good education, and sanitation. I mean, that's really, really huge. But I wanted to read some information out of here and share it with you. I took the 23andMe test. It wasn't anything riveting. I mean, I've been told my whole life certain things. Some of that was not quite accurate. And I found out I'm more German than I am Danish. And that was interesting. But I also found out, the same information about the Italian stuff in me, all of these kind of things. I found out that people who said they were my relatives really aren't my relatives. It was less than 1% match. So yeah. And then, you just have to take what some of these tests are with a grain of salt, and you have to keep moving. But what I wanted to share today is if you have any old information laying around nobody's looking at in the family, which is what happened to this, I would highly recommend you get your hands on it, get a quiet moment, and get a corner and read some of it. So I'm going to read, read one excerpt in here that I thought was interesting. Now remember, the parents that she's talking about here are her parents. They were not married in Copenhagen, but they immigrated almost at the same time, but on different ships. And they came from Copenhagen over to the United States. Somehow both ended up in Council Bluffs, Iowa. And so we're going to pick up where they got married. I am not sure where their first home was located, but feel sure it was somewhere on 5th Avenue in the uptown part of Council Bluffs. Now, that is just a few blocks from here, actually. Money was scarce in those days, and life was a bit difficult for struggling young people, but they managed on what they had and got along okay. They hadn't been married very long before they learned that their first child would be joining them soon. On November 22nd, 1893, he came, and what a fine, healthy little fellow he was. Alert, intelligent, and all anyone could ask for in every way. He was named Edmund, and his parents were very proud of him and loved him dearly. But it seems that the Lord had something else for him to do, for he called him home 2 years later on November 8th, 1895. That was such a sad day for our parents. There was a very serious disease going around, in epidemic proportions, called membranous croup, but which was no doubt a serious type of diphtheria, where the tonsils would swell up until they fill up the throat cavity and were covered with a thick white furry mucus, which choked the life out of thousands of children everywhere. Sometimes a slit was cut in the throat so a child could get air. It was a time when doctors didn't have wonderful life-saving medicine and facilities for treating serious illness as they do in our days of the 1980s. This was the dreadful illness that our little brother had contracted, and the doctor told my mother in Danish that little Edmund couldn't live, that he was going to die. Mother said Edmund understood what the doctor said and became so frightened that he ran across the bed and tried to climb the wall to get away from death. But of course he had to go. So the very next day, Edmund passed away. And this is one of the things I learned too, talking with the city and with the funeral homes, that back then people were poor, and so it was up to the family to usually put the child in some sort of a pine box and then bury them. They would actually go to the cemetery, get a plot, and then dig the hole and bury them. So the very next day, on November 9th, 1895, I decided to join my folks in their hour of sorrow. They were burying a very small, all that was left was 3.5 pounds of little Edmund. And they, my great aunt wanted to help, but they told her not to help because they were worried that she would also contract the disease. So they let her be there. They all gave him a little ceremony. And then they went up to Fairview Cemetery and buried Edmund. What's interesting is there were 2 other children that passed away. So Edmund died in 1895 at 2. In 1898, Brian died. He was only 4 months old, and the newspaper said that he had blood poisoning. And then in 1912, Crystal was only 2 months old, and in the book here, it describes Crystal as having beautiful big blue eyes, jet black hair, and very like a porcelain skin. She was just beautiful. But it never said anything else about where she was buried or what happened. The only way we were able to figure out any of this, because when I went to figure out where they were buried at in the cemetery, I went to the city that has the records, and they said, oh, I'm sorry, we don't have that on the files because there was a fire and it destroyed all the information. So a friend of mine who's been around genealogy, who's done a lot of work and has a great familiarity with Fairview Cemetery, and Fairview Cemetery is where we filmed my latest music video, Bullets and Booze. There's a lot of our friends and family buried up there. And in true Victorian fashion, we go up there and we have picnics and we visit and we take walks, because that's like a holding place for people you love, right? So anyway, my friend was able to, through the newspapers and through piecing together some information, she was able to figure out the plot and the section of the cemetery where they buried Edmund. And then when they buried Brian, they dug the same hole in the same grave, and then they just stacked the children on top, and that was traditional. The thing that bothered me the most is, as I did more research, I found out that in those days, they didn't often put up a headstone. And so these little children were born, suffered, passed away, and a lot of them, there's no memory. There's no physical place to go to that's marked. And if there's been vandalism, you're really, kind of never going to figure out where they were. So I'm hoping that there's a way that we can remember these 3 beautiful children and give them a proper headstone. So a friend of mine's going to take me over to the cemetery. We're going to go to the place that has been identified through these records that she's combed through the newspapers and everything else to find. And just so you know, reading the newspaper articles was a real interesting situation because Edmund's first name was spelled wrong. Edmund's last name was spelled wrong. All of the children's names were spelled incorrectly, both first and last names. So, you know, between the fire burning up half of the records of who's buried in the cemetery and between the newspaper articles not properly identifying, and then, you know, a lot of these kids were birthed at home, so there's not a lot of really good records around, and it's really challenging to do a lot of family history when your relatives were poor and they were immigrants. Anyway, I hope you check out your family history. And if there's any old papers, articles, books laying around that have been in the family and nobody else wants them, grab them, sit down and read them, and find out about your roots. More coming, and if I'm able to locate the grave, I'll share that with you. And I'd love to have a little headstone made to remember the 3 children. Anyway, have a great week. Thanks for watching, and I hope that your family history is able to be identified so that you can understand your roots.